Imagine waking up in the year 1345. Your teeth are throbbing. Your back is screaming from a day of harvesting rye. Your wife is in labor, and the local priest just told you the plague is on its way. What would you do to escape all of that for just a few hours? Would you drink something strange? Would you eat a mushroom you found in the forest? Would you try anything that promised relief from the endless grind of medieval life? Of course you would. We all would. And that is exactly what millions of people did. They turned to nature. They turned to herbs, roots, and fungi that could either heal them or send them on a journey they never expected. And the most surprising part, they did it all without calling it getting high. They called it medicine. They called it visions. They called it divine inspiration. Sometimes they just called it breakfast. Tonight, we are going deep into the foggy, fragrant world of medieval intoxication. The plants, the potions, the flying ointments, and the accidental mass hallucinations that made entire villages dance until they dropped. If you are ready to discover what really happened when medieval people decided to check out for a while, then stay with me. And if you enjoy deep history stories like this one, please take a moment to subscribe and like this video. It truly helps me bring you more of these strange, forgotten tales from the past. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let us step back into a time when the line between medicine and madness was thinner than a whisper. Welcome to the forbidden pharmacy of the Middle Ages. Henbane. The name sounds almost innocent. A little herb, a little remedy. But in the Middle Ages, this plant was the medieval equivalent of Russian roulette. And the trigger was your own hand. One sip of henbane tea, and you might drift into a peaceful sleep. One gulp too many, and you would find yourself locked in a terrifying waking dream. But let us begin where all medieval stories begin, with desperation. You are a peasant in a damp, cold village. Your tooth is rotting. Your joints are swollen. Your wife has been in labor for 12 hours. The local barber has a rusty saw and a prayer. Not exactly comforting. So you do what anyone would do. You go to the wise woman at the edge of the forest. She hands you a small clay cup filled with a bitter brown liquid. Drink this, she says. It will take the pain away. You drink, and the pain does fade. But so does the world around you. The room stretches. The firelight bends. Your wife's voice sounds like it is coming from the bottom of a well. And then you see it, a shape in the corner, a figure that was not there before. It speaks to you in a language you almost understand. This is henbane doing what henbane does best. Unlocking doors in your mind that were meant to stay closed. In small doses, it was a miracle, a sedative, a painkiller, a way to make childbirth bearable. In larger doses, it was chaos, hallucinations, wild agitation, a desperate thirst that no amount of water could quench, and sometimes a complete break from reality where you believed you were a bird or a tree or your own dead grandmother. The plant contains powerful alkaloids that interfere with your brain's natural chemistry. Vision blurs, time bends, and your sense of self begins to dissolve. But here is the strange part. Medieval people kept using it. They knew the risks. They knew the line between relief and ruin was thin as a blade of grass. But they used it anyway, because the alternative was worse. Pain without end, fear without relief, a life that offered no escape. So they drank the bitter tea. They rubbed the oily salve on their skin. They smoked the dried leaves. And they closed their eyes, hoping for peace. Sometimes they found it. Sometimes they found something far more frightening. A glimpse of a world they were never meant to see. A shadow that followed them long after the potion wore off. But for a few hours they were free. Free from the ache in their bones. Free from the weight of hunger and fear. Free from the cold, relentless grind of existence. And that freedom was worth the risk. At least until the visions faded and reality came crashing back. This was the bargain medieval people made with the green world. A moment of peace for a brush with madness. And they made it willingly. Again and again. But henbane was only the beginning. The garden held far darker secrets. Roots that screamed. Berries that killed with a kiss. And ointments that made people believe they could fly. We are about to step deeper into that garden. And trust me, what comes next is stranger than any fiction. Because the medieval mind did not just want to escape pain. It wanted to touch the divine. It wanted to see what the saints saw. and sometimes it wanted to dance with the devil himself. All it took was a root, a berry, a drop of honey, and a willingness to cross the line. And now we step deeper into that shadowy garden, past the henbane and its bitter promises, past the line where sleep ends and madness begins. Because the medieval world held a root so strange, so terrifying, and so human-shaped that it became the stuff of legend. Mandrake. This was not just a plant. This was a creature trapped in the earth. A twisted, contorted figure with stubby arms and a bulbous head that looked exactly like a tiny, screaming man. And according to every herbalist, every healer, and every terrified peasant, the mandrake did not come out of the ground quietly. It screamed, not a little squeak, not a whisper, a shriek so powerful, so lethal that the sound alone could kill you dead on the spot. Just hearing it could stop your heart. And yet people still dug it up, because the mandrake was also a miracle. A sedative so strong it could knock you out cold before surgery. A hallucinogen so potent it could show you the face of God, or the devil, depending on your luck and your dosage. But how do you harvest a root that screams you to death? The medieval solution was genius, and absolutely brutal. You tie a hungry dog to the root. You cover your ears. You walk away and let the poor animal do the work. The assumption was simple. The dog would die instead of you. A sacrifice offered to the plant's fury. And when the screaming stopped, you would return to find the mandrake free and the dog lifeless. A fair trade in the cold logic of the Middle Ages. Once harvested, the mandrake was dried, powdered, or steeped in wine. It became a charm worn around the neck to ward off evil spirits. A fertility aid tucked into a pouch and carried close to the body. A truth serum slipped into a rival's drink to make them confess their darkest secrets. But the mandrake did not just heal. It revealed. People who consumed it often experienced visions. Vivid prophetic dreams that felt more real than waking life. They saw angels. They saw demons. They saw the faces of the dead and heard their whispered warnings. In a world without anesthesia, the mandrake was a lifeline. In a world without psychiatry, it was a gateway to the unconscious mind. But there was a price. The root could also induce vomiting and unconsciousness. It could make your heart race or stop entirely. It could trap you in a hallucination so vivid that you could not find your way back. And the church watched all of this with a suspicious eye. Visions, they said, belonged to saints, not shrubs. A peasant who saw angels after drinking mandrake wine was not blessed. They were probably possessed, and possession had a cure: fire. So the mandrake was hidden, used in secret, passed from wise woman to wise woman. A forbidden tool in a world that feared what it could not control. But the root was too valuable to abandon entirely. Even monks copied mandrake recipes into their herbal manuscripts. They recorded its uses in careful Latin. They described the screaming root and the dog and the visions with a fascination that bordered on obsession. They knew the danger. They used it anyway, because some pains required desperate remedies, and some doors once opened cannot be closed. But the mandrake was not the deadliest plant in the medieval garden. That honor belongs to a flower so beautiful it could kill you with a single kiss. That honor belongs to a flower so beautiful it could kill you with a single kiss. Belladonna, deadly nightshade. The name alone should have been warning enough. But medieval people were not easily deterred by danger, especially when that danger came wrapped in petals of deep purple and promised to make them irresistible. Belladonna means beautiful lady, and it earned that name for a reason. Wealthy women, and some men too, would crush the berries and drip the extract into their eyes. The result was immediate and striking. Their pupils would dilate wide and dark like the night sky. And in the flickering candlelight of a medieval feast, those wide eyes were considered the height of beauty. Mysterious, alluring, almost otherworldly. A woman with belladonna eyes could stop a room cold. She could make a prince forget his duty. She could make a rival weep with envy. But here is the secret they did not speak of at the feast. Those beautiful eyes could not see clearly. The same poison that dilated the pupils also blurred the vision. It made the world soft and dreamlike. It made faces swim in the candlelight. It made distance impossible to judge. And if you used too much, you would go blind. A small price for beauty. Or so they told themselves. But belladonna was not just a cosmetic. It was a tool, a weapon, a means of control. In small, carefully measured doses, it could ease pain and quiet a restless mind. Physicians used it to numb patients before surgery. Midwives used it to slow bleeding after childbirth. And some women used it to make their rivals appear dull and plain by comparison. A drop of belladonna in a drink could make a man confess his secrets. A drop on a lover's lips could make them forget all others. And a drop too many could make them sleep forever. The plant contains atropine and scopolamine, two alkaloids that wage war on the nervous system. They slow the heart. They blur the mind. They open the doors of perception and invite in chaos. In the Middle Ages, there was no precise dosage, no warning label, no regulation. A healer measured with her eye and her instinct. A mistake could send a patient into convulsions. A mistake could stop their breath. A mistake could make them see things that were not there. Things that whispered and beckoned and promised more than any earthly pleasure. And yet they kept using it, because the alternative was worse. Pain, fear, the slow decay of the body. Belladonna offered an escape, a way to slip the bonds of suffering and float for a while in a haze of shadows and dreams. It offered control in a world where control was an illusion. And it offered beauty in a world where beauty was currency. But the church saw something else. They saw women with dilated eyes and called them witches. They saw men who muttered strange prophecies and called them heretics. They saw the blurred line between medicine and magic, and they drew a hard line through it. Belladonna became forbidden. Its use drove underground. A secret whispered between healers in the dark. A tool of the cunning folk who knew that sometimes the only way to survive was to dance with poison. But the deadliest poisons were not always consumed by mouth. Sometimes they were rubbed into the skin, into the soft, vulnerable places where the barrier between body and spirit is thinnest. And that is where the medieval world truly crossed the line into madness. Because it did not just want to heal or to see visions. They wanted to fly. They wanted to fly. And they found a way. But the path to flight was not what you might imagine. No wings. No magic words. Just a thick green salve and a broomstick. The flying ointment. This was the dark heart of medieval witchcraft. A recipe passed down through generations of cunning folk. A blend of henbane and belladonna and mandrake and datura mixed with animal fat until it formed a greasy paste. The ingredients were well known to any herbalist. The danger was also well known. These plants could kill you if swallowed. The stomach rejected them violently. So the ointment was applied to the skin. But not just anywhere. The wise women knew that some parts of the body absorbed faster than others. More intimately. More directly. And so the ointment was rubbed into the soft tissues. The places that medieval texts describe with careful euphemism. The places where the barrier between flesh and spirit is almost transparent. The effect was nearly instantaneous. A warmth spreading through the body. A tingling in the limbs. A rushing sensation as if the heart had left the chest and was floating just above the skin. And then the visions began. A sense of rising. A feeling of weightlessness. The ground falling away beneath you. The rooftops shrinking to pinpricks. The moon growing large and close enough to touch. You were flying. Or at least your mind believed you were. The alkaloids in the ointment flooded your nervous system. They disrupted your sense of balance. They rewrote your perception of space and time. Your body was still there, trembling and sweating in a dark cottage. But your mind was soaring over the village, over the fields, over the sleeping world. The experience was both terrifying and ecstatic. A liberation from the prison of the flesh. A taste of what the saint called rapture and the church called demonic possession. Some users described attending grand feasts in the sky, dancing with beautiful strangers, making promises they could not remember when they woke. Others described being carried away by dark figures, whisked through the air to secret gatherings where they swore allegiance to forces they did not understand. And when they woke hours later confused and covered in bruises they could not explain. They believed every moment of it was real. The church believed too. They saw the ointment as evidence of a pact with the devil, a ritual of corruption that could not be forgiven. And so the flying ointment became the cornerstone of witch trials. Proof that the accused had consorted with demons. Proof that they had abandoned God for the pleasures of the flesh. But the truth was simpler and far more human. The flying ointment was just medicine. Misunderstood, feared, used by desperate people seeking escape from the grinding misery of their lives. They wanted to feel something other than hunger and cold and fear. They wanted to transcend their bodies for just a few hours. And they found a way. It was not magic. It was chemistry. It was not demonic. It was desperation. But try telling that to a terrified village. Try telling that to a priest with a Bible and a pyre. The ointment users were hunted, tortured, burned, and the recipes were driven underground, lost to the shadows where they would wait for centuries to be rediscovered. But the flying ointment was not the strangest way medieval people altered their minds. Because sometimes the most powerful hallucinogen was not a plant at all. It was bread. Bread that went bad. Bread that carried a hidden passenger. A fungus that would turn whole villages into dancing maniacs. And that story begins not in a witch's cottage, but in a baker's oven. A fungus that would turn whole villages into dancing maniacs. Ergot. This was not a plant you sought out. This was not a root you harvested with ritual and reverence. This was a mistake. A hidden passenger in the daily bread. A parasite that grew on rye and turned innocent loaves into keys to the madhouse. In cold, damp years when the rain fell heavy on the fields, the ergot fungus thrived. It blackened the kernels. It swelled and burst and released its invisible poison into the grain. The peasants did not know. They could not see the danger. They just gathered the rye, as they always had, ground it into flour, kneaded it into dough, and baked it into the bread that would sustain them through the long winter. But that bread carried a dark secret. Alkaloids that constricted blood vessels. Alkaloids that scrambled the nervous system. Alkaloids that opened a door in the brain that was never meant to be opened. The first symptom was a creeping sensation in the limbs. A tingling, a burning, as if the fingers and toes were slowly being replaced by something else. Something that did not belong to you. Then came the convulsions. Uncontrollable spasms that twisted the body into strange shapes. And then came the hallucinations. The true horror. Whole villages would suddenly erupt into madness. Men and women leaving their homes without warning. Their eyes glassy, their faces slack, and they would begin to dance. Not a joyful celebration, not a festival. A frantic, desperate thrashing as if they were trying to shake something off. As if their bodies were no longer their own. They would dance for hours, for days, for weeks, until their legs gave out, until their hearts exploded, until they collapsed in the mud and never rose again. The church called it divine punishment, a plague sent by an angry God to humble the sinful. The villagers called it a curse, a demonic infestation that had taken root in their midst. But it was none of those things. It was just bread. Bread infected with a fungus that turned the human mind into a nightmare machine. The victims saw things that were not there. Visions of monstrous creatures crawling out of walls. Whispers from dead relatives urging them to join the dance. A sense of burning from the inside out as the poison constricted their veins. And the madness was contagious. Not in the way a disease spreads, but in the way panic spreads. In the way fear spreads. When one person began to dance, others followed, driven by the same poison bread, or driven by the sheer terror of watching their neighbors writhe and scream. The dancing plagues swept across Europe like waves. Entire communities overwhelmed by the compulsion to move, to thrash, to shake, to escape the fire in their blood. And no one understood why. Not the priests, not the physicians, not the desperate families who watched their loved ones stagger and fall. The cure they eventually discovered was almost laughably simple. Different bread, wheat instead of rye, a change in diet that cut off the source of the poison. But it took generations to connect the dots. Generations of suffering, generations of madness, generations of people who believed they had been touched by something dark and unholy. Today we know the truth. Ergotism, a medical condition, a tragedy of ignorance. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous things come not from a witch's cauldron, but from a peasant's plate. But even with all this danger, all this madness, medieval people still sought escape. They drank the henbane. They rubbed on the ointments. They chewed the roots and swallowed the powders. And they did it not because they were reckless, but because they were human. And the human need to escape the weight of existence is older than any herb, stronger than any poison, and still with us today. And still with us today. But after all the salves and brews and roots and ointments and dancing plagues, one question still lingers in the quiet spaces between the stories. How did medieval people actually feel about getting high? The answer is not simple. It is a tangle of contradictions, a web of fear and fascination, a battle between the body's desperate craving for relief and the soul's terror of losing control. For the healers and herbalists who prepared these substances, the line was clear. This was medicine. This was their craft, their calling, their sacred duty. They knew the risks because they had seen the consequences. They had watched patients slip into madness. They had held the hands of those who took too much. They had buried the ones who never woke up. And still they mixed the potions. Still they measured the doses. Still they offered the bitter cups to trembling hands. Because the alternative was letting people suffer, letting them scream, letting them die in agony when a single sip of henbane tea could have eased their passing. That was the dark bargain of medieval medicine. A little poison to fight a greater poison. A controlled descent into madness to avoid the chaos of unrelenting pain. But the church saw things differently. The church saw altered states as threats to the divine order. Visions were supposed to come from heaven, not from roots. Saints would speak with angels. Peasants who saw things after drinking mandrake wine were not blessed. They were dangerous. They were open to demonic influence. They were wandering too close to the edge of the holy and the unholy where the devil lurked and whispered promises. So the church drew a line, a hard, unforgiving line. Medicine was acceptable. Mystical experiences that bypassed the priestly hierarchy were not. And any woman who mixed ointments for visions was not a healer. She was a witch. But the common people, the ones who lived and died in the shadow of the church, held a more complicated view. They knew the difference between a healing potion and a poison. They had seen their grandmothers prepare the remedies. They had tasted the bitter teas and felt the strange warmth spread through their bodies. They knew the risks because they had watched their neighbors dance and scream and collapse. But they also knew the alternative. A life of unrelenting pain. A life without mercy. A life where hunger and cold and fear were the only constants. In that context, a little madness was a fair trade. A few hours of peace. A few hours of forgetting. A few hours of feeling something other than the weight of existence. So they used the herbs. They kept the recipes. They passed the knowledge from mother to daughter. And they did not speak of it to the priest. Because the priest did not understand. The priest had never starved. The priest had never watched a child die of fever. The priest had never felt the slow creep of gangrene or the sharp stab of a rotten tooth. The priest had comfort, but the herbalist had cures. And the people knew which one they needed more. So the medieval view of intoxication remained fractured, divided between the healers who saw it as a tool and the church who saw it as a threat, and the peasants who saw it as survival. Each group interpreted the same plants in completely different ways. And each group was right in their own context. The healers were right because they saw the suffering and could not bear it. The church was right because they saw the chaos and could not control it. And the peasants were right because they were the ones who had to live through the pain. So they made their choices. They drank the bitter teas. They rubbed the stinging ointments. They ate the strange mushrooms. They danced the frantic dances. And in doing so, they revealed something fundamental about what it means to be human. A truth that connects us across the centuries. A truth that whispers to us from the depths of the Middle Ages. When life becomes unbearable, when the weight of existence presses down on our shoulders, we will do anything at all, to feel lighter, to feel free, to feel just for a moment that we can float above our troubles and leave them far below. The medieval people were not so different from us. They just had different tools, and they used them without apology, because survival is its own justification. An escape is a human right. And no matter how many centuries pass, we will always be the same creatures, looking for a way to fly.